Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people, normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Greg Adams. Greg is program coordinator for the Center for Good Mourning and Staff Bereavement Support at Arkansas Children's Hospital. During his 29 years at Arkansas Children's Hospital, Greg has worked in oncology and helped start the Center for Good Mourning and the palliative care program. The Center for Good Mourning includes grief support groups for children, teens, and families, community outreach and education, and an electronic grief loss newsletter called The Mourning News. In 2019, Greg wrote an illustrated children's storybook about coping with grief and loss called Adam Gets Back in the Game. Greg is a member of the Association of Death Education and Counseling, where he earned the credential of Fellow in Thanatology, Death, Dying, and Bereavement. Greg, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So Greg, let's dive right in. Was there a personal experience or inspiration that led you to your work in bereavement care? And would you mind sharing that with our audience?
Thank you. I think about it as two different ways to tell my story. One is that, professionally, I got into work in a hospital and started working in oncology, and then grief and loss, are huge parts of that. And then one thing led to another. Another is that my father was an educator, and my mom grew up as a daughter of a funeral home director in a small town, and she lived in a funeral home. And so I ended up being a death educator. And so maybe that's not that big of a surprise. But when I look back at my life, I can think about that. When I was a boy, when I was 10 years old, there was about 3 years where there were three really big losses in my mother's family. My grandmother died on my mom's side. Her brother died the next year. Then her father died the next year. And in our little town back then, we spent a couple nights of visitation at the funeral home before the funeral. And so I felt like I was at the funeral home all the time, and I saw the impact it had on my mom, which was really great. And then the other probably loss that really has impacted me was when my wife and I had been married for about a year and a half. Very unexpectedly, my father-in-law killed himself. And I was, as a young husband and not having worked in this area, I felt totally over my head. And that loss has had a great deal of impact on us in our family and personally and professionally, because I've had a special place, in my head and my heart for people who deal with losses by suicide.
Wow. So you really grew up in the death business.
In some ways, that's true.
I hate to say that.
We just lived a few blocks away from one of my uncle. By the time I grew up, my grandfather had started several funeral homes. I had three uncles who did funeral homes in three small towns in Missouri. And we, for part of my time, we lived just a few blocks away from one of them. And if they needed extra help getting somebody's hair fixed or something, my mom would go in to help. And so I would see that. And I remember my mom told me a couple of things growing up. One is I would hear her and my dad both say that there's worse things worse than dying. And I think that affected me in my palliative care and serious illness work. And then she would have girlfriends who would not stay the night with her when she lived at the funeral home as a kid. And that she said her parents always told her that no reason to fear the dead, that it's the living that can hurt you. And I've that really stuck with me too.
Wow.
Interesting.
So Greg, I'm curious. You and I have known each other for many years,
Yes.
And I've enjoyed a wonderful relationship and friendship with you. But I am curious. I don't know that we've ever talked about so I know those things kind of inspire and sometimes they lead us into what we do. But how did you find your way to your position at Arkansas Children's? And can you talk a little bit about the work that you do there?
Yeah, so I came here to Children's Hospital after I had worked for 4 years in residential treatment for teenagers, and I was needing a change, and I thought, well, I'll do this for a little while. I'd never thought about working in a hospital, and I'd only been here a few months when the social worker who worked in the pediatric oncology area changed positions, and that became open, and I had to fill in on a couple of different situations there. And I was really drawn to it because those families were dealing with serious illness, the threat of death and dying, and dealing with really big and important stuff. And that attracted me, and you could really get to know people. And they were open to support, as in some other place in the hospital, you'd walk in and say, I'm the social worker, and they didn't know why you were there, and they might be concerned you were there to check them out and investigate them. But here, people mostly intuitively knew that, hey, this is a terrible situation. We need all the help we can get. And so those 10 years were incredibly formative for me. We're learning from kids and families and seeing the other team members, doctors and nurses do what they do. And it was during that time that we started a grief support group program. And some of it was not chosen. It was the chair that we had a committee looking into what we could do to help kids. And she was going to leave the hospital, and she told me in her office one day, she said, you will be the chair of this committee when I leave. It was not a choice. And because she left and gave me that assignment, I have the job I have today, because one thing led to another, and it really seemed to be a really good fit for me as we did our grief support groups, and then we did more things in the community, and then I came back in the hospital to work with our palliative care.
It's interesting. I've said this many times, just telling my own story, but I think it's true that sometimes we make choices in life, and then sometimes life chooses us.
Yeah.
So the circumstances present themselves, and we find ourselves doing something where, I don't know about you. I wasn't sitting around as a kid going, I think when I grow up, I'm going to do death and dying,
No, I think that's very true. My wife and I have 2 children, and we've told them before that both the jobs that we've had didn't exist when we were in school. And I would say, just go back to your question, Fran, along the way, that after I got into this work, one thing that affected me was between our 2 children, we lost a baby with anencephaly. A baby developed with no brain, and so we made it about halfway through the pregnancy before we delivered. And that was so I was already in the work, but that was a profoundly influential experience, because it gave me a window into some of the bereaved parents that I had met and continue to have contact with that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And it wasn't, for me, everybody's story is different, and it wasn't for me the same as if one of my other children had died. But it was probably the most profoundly sad thing I've ever experienced.
Sure. And, it's interesting. So did your work influence how you were able to grieve through that process with your family, or did your experience influence more of the work that you do holding the hope for others?
Well, I guess the answer is yes, because, it does in this kind of work, as people who are into it, it goes both ways. And so, my own experience certainly went with me, into that. And, but the experiences I had with other people also influenced me here. And in one kind of odd way, I remember when my wife and I were facing that situation, that I found some comfort in the fact that I had been with these other families, and I thought, they found a way to deal with things, and some of them had many more challenges than my wife and I faced in our lives, and yet they found a way to survive and do things. We will find a way, to do it, and in some ways it was a weird kind of a comfort.
They became your support mechanism, your silent support mechanism.
In some way. It was the other interesting, and I've written about this. I've written an essay just about my own experiences with that one. But in my head, growing up in my family, we had music was a big piece of it, and we played music, we sang songs, a situation would come up and a song would come up that would fit the situation. And so that was just very typical. So we had a memorial song that we played at the memorial, at a service for our baby who we lost. And when I went back to work, I was on call, and in the middle of the night, I was working with a family who had a baby die. And I'm going down to get the camera, because back then people didn't have cameras in their phones. And I was getting the camera to take pictures of the baby because the family wanted that. And I realized after a while that in my head, I have this song is playing in my head. That's from my own personal experience, but it was playing in my head from what we had gone through.
Sure, a deep connection there. Very deep.
Well, I think it's one of the things that helps us to do the work. I don't know how people do this type of work unless you can feel, and I know we have to protect ourselves and all of those things and good boundaries, and won't necessarily make it a talk about that, but I think what makes many of us effective at this is that we allow ourselves to feel, in what we do. But there's a level of caring that exists.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah.
No, I think so. I think to open oneself up to somebody else's pain means you're opening yourself up into your own things too, and to find your way to do that in a way that where you're helpful to the other person, don't get lost in that. It's certainly a challenge, and I think anybody who does this, they know that it's a practice, because it's something you never quit trying to work with. But,
Right, you don't ever perfect it, but it's important so that you can have longevity. Though you do have to find that balance.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in those things.
Yeah, somebody told me years ago, and I wish I knew who told me this, because I would want to give them credit. But they said, we don't give all of ourselves in our work. We give the best of ourselves, and so because you have to save something, and so we give our best self, but not our whole self. Mm-hmm. And I believe, frankly, I believe that. I think we try to be as real and present as possible, but we also have to be grounded so that we can still help somebody and not be overwhelmed by the situation that they may be feeling overwhelmed by.
Yeah. Greg, can you tell us about your book, Adam Gets Back in the Game?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. That was an unexpected thing too, as kind of going back to what Andy said. I was at an ADEC conference, an Association of Death Education and Counseling, and I gave an illustration that in a presentation that I've given a lot about, talking about kind of an absurd illustration about if I was to leave the building and somebody had a broken bottle in the parking lot and I tripped and I fell down and I got up and I had a piece of glass stuck in my hand, that's the grief part. That's a hurt. I didn't choose it, I didn't want it, but there it is. So what am I going to do about it? And so with groups and with kids and adults, sometimes we'll say, well, what could I do about it? We can take it out, get help, or we could just leave it there. And if they don't suggest that, I might suggest that. And then we talk about how silly that would be if I left there and I went back home with a glass in my hand and I went to my day and gave my wife a hug and did my exercises and stuff. What would happen if I just left it there? And of course, terrible things would happen. It would get worse, and I could get infected, and I would hurt the people around me that I love, and it's not going to feel better. And that's a silly thing, but that's a real thing, because people do that. We know they have really big hurts in their lives. They don't give it the attention that it needs, and it causes all these troubles. It makes a mess. It hurts other people and causes pain that they wouldn't have to have otherwise. And so somebody came up to me after that presentation. They said, "You need to put that in a children's book." And I'd never thought about it.
You need to put that in an adult's book.
Right. Exactly right.
So one thing led to another, and we found an illustrator, and I found a publisher, and we put it in a children's book about a boy who had that experience where he falls and he put the glass in his hand. He doesn't want to deal with it. He imagines what would happen if he just ignores it. It's not going to work out. So he does. He gets some help from his friends and his family, and then the parallel story afterward is his best friend dies unexpectedly, and again he doesn't want to deal with it like he did the first time, but eventually he looks at the lessons he learned about how did he heal from that other one, injury that he experienced, and he takes steps toward a more healing place, not forgetting, but in a more healing place. And so it was a really positive experience, and the response so far has been positive from people who've read it, and from kids and adults, that it's something that they can understand. It's an illustration that they seem to be able to understand.
Wonderful.
Well, one of the things I love about the book, Greg, is I mean, there's a lot of children's books out there, a lot of great ones, you know, written around grief and death and dying. There's also some that are written that are more. Kids are such concrete thinkers, and there'll be people who write a lot of books they're talking about things that are abstract or hard for kids to understand. And this is taking an abstract concept, like if you don't deal with your grief, you can hurt yourself and you can hurt others, right? And giving them a context, giving children a context, and quite frankly, I think Fran's right, giving some adults a context to understand that, you know, wounds are things we have to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it helps me, and a lot of this, just to be able to think about, if we're going to try to explain hard things, is to how can we put it in a way that people can understand and grasp? And I do think that's a really piece of the work that I've done over the years, and whatever I've done is trying to take things that are sometimes difficult to understand and present them in a way that are more understandable and more approachable and people can grasp, whether it's adults or for kids, because I think that's a big challenge. Whether it's an illness, it's a loss, how do you explain this terrible situation to somebody in a way that we can have a conversation about it, even though it's so distressing? And I think that really applies to all kinds of different situations.
So true. So true.
Well, Greg, we actually we're almost out of time, but before we move on with things, I wanted to. Sometimes people who are listening in want to know how they can connect with our guests. How can they connect with you, with your work, with your book? How might they do that?
So the easiest way to get to me and the work that we do here is we have a website, which is part of the Arkansas Children's Hospital website, and it's goodmourningcenter.org, and that's morning with a U, as you would guess, MOURNING. So goodmourningcenter.org, and it has information about our newsletter and about the programs that we do here. There's also a way to contact me that way. And as far as the book goes, the book, by the way, the proceeds of the book, any personal proceeds go to the program here at Arkansas Children's Hospital, the Center for Good Mourning. But it can be found on Amazon and other places like that. If they Google for Adam Gets Back in the Game, they can find that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Greg, again, we want to thank you for being a guest here at Let's Talk Death and for sharing your personal journey and the story behind your book.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure, and I'm really glad to be connected with the good work that you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Greg. And thanks to those who are joining this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults. It's a program we call Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Death.